Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. Join your hosts, Anita Russell, Mavis Bauman, and Gail Hunter, as we create a brave space for conversations about racism, personal transformation, and accountability. Conversation provides a means to dive deeply into your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs, and examine what emerges in your words, actions, and behaviors. The show is a journey towards anti-racism by cultivating change within yourself first and then out into the world. Learn to engage in racial dialogue using 4 tools: courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. Discover how truth, reconciliation, and healing can emerge from honest and deliberate conversations. Manifest social change right now on Inflection Point Podcast. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Inflection Point Podcast here on Transformation Talk Radio. I am your host, Anita Russell, and let's get a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis and Gail.
Hi, I'm Mavis Bauman.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter.
Excellent, excellent. So as usual, we have a specific topic and a specific question that we're going to address in this episode. And the topic is redlining, the scourge of the American scam. And the question is, how did the New Deal create forced segregation that compromised equitable fulfillment of the American dream? And one of the primary resources that we use for this work, sort of gathering all of our information and doing some research, is it's called UnDesign the Redlining, and it's actually a virtual tour of the UnDesign the Redline exhibit, which was developed by Designing the We, which is a nonprofit organization. And until recently, it was on view at the Union for Contemporary Art in Omaha, Nebraska. And everybody knows that Omaha, Nebraska is part of the area where Mavis grew up. So there's one of those.
Close enough.
Yeah, really one of those powerful connections and all of that. So when you hear this phrase, redline, and how that phrase ties into the American dream and the creation of the middle class through the New Deal programs and the Federal Housing Administration and all of these different things under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And this all was happening during the time of Depression. And everybody knows that that was a time period of unprecedented unemployment. The economic systems were kind of falling apart, and foreclosures, home foreclosures was really rampant, and people just losing their homes. And it required a new approach. It required sort of a different approach to being able to solve this problem. And so Roosevelt came up with this whole thing called the New Deal. And the New Deal was primarily associated with public housing, but it ended up producing a practice called redlining. And redlining sort of created this system, it entrenched even further, I should say, the system of segregation, but from a public housing perspective. So I'm going to read a little bit of information from an article. This is actually a South African gentleman. He was born and raised in Durban, which is in the KwaZulu-Natal region of South Africa. So if you heard Mavis and I talk, you know that we've been in that region of South Africa. This young man is an architect. He studied architecture, right? And this is what he has to say. Architecture is at the root of racial bias against people of color in America and around the world. Although informal discrimination and segregation has always existed in the United States, The 1934, the Federal Housing Administration instituted the National Housing Act that began the discriminatory practice called redlining. So then he goes further into describing what redlining actually is. So I'm going to assume that there are a lot of people in our audience or listeners have probably heard the term, but maybe not necessarily knowing the full breadth of what that practice meant, essentially. So redlining is an unethical practice, and this is from the same gentleman. Redlining is an unethical practice that places services out of reach for residents of certain areas based on race or ethnicity. It can be seen in the systematic denial of mortgages, insurance, loans, and other financial services based on location rather than individual qualification and credit worthiness. So this resulted in the dividing of neighborhoods along racial lines, leading banks to start lending to certain neighborhoods while not lending to others, all based on race. The zoning laws and the lending legislation at the time institutionally crippled predominantly African-American neighborhoods, all the while lending to white neighborhoods, enabling the accumulation of wealth. So we all know that that's one of the big things that's associated with the accumulation of wealth, is having real estate, owning your own home, and all of that. But it really requires an understanding of how we actually got to that point. And so one of the, in addition to the Federal Housing Administration, there was also another thing that was introduced called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And that is the practice, that was where the practice of actual redlining actually evolved out of that. And so if you go back to the 30s, right, when people got their mortgages, the requirements were 50% down, right? And then you made payments. But the payments that you made didn't necessarily go towards the principal. It basically went towards interest. And then when the term of the loan expired in about 5 or 7 years, that's when you paid off the principal, right? So under this new thing, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, it offered borrowers the opportunity to have 15-year terms and also amortized payment plans. And what that essentially meant was you're paying off principal and you're paying off interest at the same time. And it's the paying off of the principal is what gives you equity. And so not being able to have access to that cripples people, Black communities, other people of colors from that standpoint, because that was part of building up equity. And we all know that when you build up equity in your home, that also translates into good schools, because the schools are based on the tax base and all of that. So you can see how all of these things end up being intricately connected, right? And so the next part of the story is that this HOLC obviously expected these loans to be paid back. Like, it wasn't, we're just giving you money and you have the choice, either pay us back or not pay us back. They expected that. And so because of that expectation, they started implementing practices where they looked at the risk of a borrower, right? And so the way that they did that was by hiring local real estate agents to now go in and appraise property. So everybody knows when you buy a house, part of that process is getting the appraisal. So that appraisal system, you can trace it back to the HOLC, right? So these real estate agents, however, were bound by the segregationist code of ethics, which assumed that African-American residents equaled lower property values and therefore a higher risk of default, right? And so out of that thinking, out of that segregationist code of ethics, emerged this whole way of color coding different areas. And so you end up with these 4 specific color codes. And I'm going to run through the list because I want everybody to make sure everybody can kind of get a strong sense of what this systematic practice looked like. Okay. So if you were in the green area, right, this is essentially an ethnically homogeneous, US born, upper middle class neighborhood. So you can kind of translate that to mean white, essentially. And then you have the people who live in the blue coded areas, which are, they're still desirable, nearly all white, mostly US born, low chance of immigrants or people of color actually living in this particular area. Then you start getting into the yellow. So by the time you start getting into the yellow, things are kind of getting to be a little bit different, okay? So in the yellow, that was defined as this area is definitely declining. It's bordering on Black neighborhoods. There are European immigrants are there, and it's working class people as opposed to middle or upper class people, okay? So now we're talking class distinction as well. And then you get into the last area, which impacts my community the most. And that's where the word red line actually comes from, because this is the red zone, essentially. So, and that is determined to be a hazardous, high risk area that you don't want to invest in. You don't want to provide these financial services because you basically believe that everybody's going to default because they're Black people, etc. Right? And so this is the situation that ended up being created. So you have this race-based housing that is systematically discriminating because it's built into something that actually came out of the U.S. government, right? With these the housing, the public housing and you know, changing the mortgage principles and interest, and all of that had a very damaging impact on Black communities. And though that impact, we still can experience, we're still experiencing that today in different locations.
You know,
So-
Anita, just real quick, I don't think you mentioned yet, but that the government kept these segregated parts of a city secret. This wasn't something that was
Right.
let out to the public, correct?
That's
Except for banking, right?
The
right.
investors
So
knew.
Bankers knew where to invest, but
right,
it wasn't
exactly.
something that was commonly known.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you have to remember,
Mhm.
usually when things are set up systematically, they're designed to be invisible.
Right.
Otherwise, if we knew that, you know, maybe we
Oh,
would
good
have,
point.
it gives us a different course of action perhaps
Right.
to take. But systematically, institutionally, this is all the stuff that's built in. But that's also part of the reason why it's so difficult to have these conversations about racism, because so many people out there don't even see it, can't even see it, because it's disguised very nicely, right? And
Very
so
nicely,
if you
thoroughly.
understand, right, if you understand the idea of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if you decide that this area over here, or even if you look at it from an educational perspective, we'll look at it from that perspective. If you're a teacher and you decide that this child over here is not capable of learning, this child over here just does not have the intellect, doesn't have the study skills, doesn't have this. And so the way that you teach is going to reflect what you think about that person. And eventually, because this is the system that this child is being educated under, they start to believe that stuff. And so now you end up with this self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Because the teacher is feeding into the student where you're not really that smart, and you really should be in the special ed, or you really should be over here, or you shouldn't be over here. And that child starts to take on the characteristics. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy. And it shows up like in this as well. So in when you compare it to the education, when you have the system, when you have the government that is essentially saying, well, Black people are lazy, Black people can't do this, they can't take care of their property, they can't do this, they can't do all that. And so if you're a person that doesn't understand these practices that are going on behind the scenes, you begin to believe that.
Mhm.
Right? You begin to believe that. And I'm not talking about the people who live in those communities. I'm talking about the people who are outside, those people who monolithically define us in a certain kind of way. You begin to believe all of that
Mhm.
until you start to enlighten yourself,
Mhm.
until you start to discover what you don't know.
Mhm.
And that's a lot of what we kind of talk about, is this whole idea of people understanding that you don't know what you don't know, because it was intentionally implemented in a certain way that it was hidden from view, right? And all of that also, that self-fulfilling prophecy on the one hand, but it also contributes to the cycle of privilege.
Right.
And at this point, I'm going to
Right.
turn it over to Gail, because she's really going to talk about how that redlining actually shows up.
In many different ways. Well, and one of the things I wanted to say about what you're saying, I was going to get to it later, but it's right here, is that think about how many people that are white have heard, we don't want a Black person or Black family to move into our neighborhood because it's going to deteriorate the neighborhood, right? They never did any studies on that. The actual reality is that when a white neighborhood in suburbia allowed a Black person to buy a house there, it actually drove the price of the house up, because they had to pay more money than what the white people did. And so it was completely opposite of what the actual reality was. But that kind of message that came down from the government on down infiltrated and just supported what was already there in place, right, for decades and hundreds of years. You know, right. So I was going to go through some of the topics of how the redlining has affected certain areas, and one of them was supermarkets and other shopping opportunities. Lower income families have access to fewer supermarkets and other healthy food retail outlets that provide a wide selection of affordable and nutritious foods. The problem impacts residents of both urban and rural areas across the country, as compounded by disproportionately higher rates of diet-related disease and the lost commercial vitality that makes communities really livable and helps local economies thrive. The challenge of healthy food access is notably persistent for those living in communities of color, the very same communities that are quickly growing in number and population. An interesting thing that I read in this one article is that by 2044, it's believed the majority of Americans will actually be people of color. Historically, though, people of color have lived in and continue to live in the most under-resourced communities, with the lowest performing schools, poor access to transportation, inequitable access to affordable, healthy food, and the furthest distance from quality jobs. Intentional and persistent disinvestment and discriminatory credit practices, which is redlining that you talked about, Anita, in these communities have contributed to the deep racial disparities in health and economic resources. One major consequence of redlining are called food deserts. The United States Department of Agriculture defines food deserts as low income, typically urban communities lacking stores that sell healthy and affordable food. Without access to good quality food, impoverished areas are subjected to hunger, to poor diets, obesity, and other diet-related illnesses. The United States Department of Agriculture data says about 23.5 million people live in low-income food desert areas. That's roughly 8.4% of the United States population. Also, households of 2.3 million people live more than a mile from a supermarket and do not have access to a vehicle. How are they going to get there? How are they going to be able to access the food? Even a mile away doesn't sound long, but if you're 60, 70, 80, and you don't have a car, you don't have means to get to the grocery store, what options do you have? So food deserts are also connected to the supermarket redlining, which is defined by the National Institutes of Health. It's a term used to describe major chain supermarkets' disinterest in building store locations in inner cities or low-income neighborhoods, and usually pulling their existing stores out and relocating them to the suburbs. Communities without access to supermarket chains that provide some of the organic and natural and pesticide-free foods are clearly at a disadvantage to be able to access any of that food. Even if these supermarkets were built in low-income areas, unless the neighborhood received more economic and community support, it would also then probably lead to more of a mass, what's called gentrification. where lower income neighborhoods in cities that have been really developed, what happens then is that the upper class white people that want to live in the city and want to make improvements in this area, they move in, and people that have lower income have to move out because they can't afford them. So it's defeating at many levels, right? So the suggestions that I read were actually pretty interesting. It said one is investing more in fresh food stocks at the existing local medium to small side grocery stores and corner stores by encouraging more of the developments of those that would actually carry some of the more nutritious foods and organic or pesticide-free foods. In 1993, I think the Business Enterprise Trust was a nonprofit group characterized the retail industry's attitude, saying it makes no sense to serve distressed areas when profits in the serene suburbs come so easily.
Mm-hmm.
That's the mentality I think that's probably been continuing, right? Another topic area was on the business and job opportunities. For many Americans, the Great Recession and its aftermath highlighted that working hard and playing by the rules is not really necessarily a guarantee for economic success. And the Great Recession was around 2008 and 2009 when the stock market crashed. Today, ordinary middle and working class families work very long hours, often at multiple jobs, in the quest to provide for themselves and their families. But although this recession officially ended years ago, many Americans lives are still fraught with a lot of economic instability and insecurity. And Americans took a hit from the speculation-fueled crash of the Great Recession. And what's interesting, what happened, a big piece of what happened with that is that lenders were now lending people that really couldn't afford the mortgages that they were on the house they were buying, and they couldn't afford the payments, which is not that dissimilar to what happened earlier, decades before. The contribution of workers of color in building and supporting the U.S. economy can also not be overstated. For workers of color, they've planted and they've picked our fields, they've built our roads and railroads, they've taught our children, they've built financial empires, advocated for our rights in the streets and in the halls of justice. They've served in the highest reaches of government. And in the current moment, workers of color continue to serve and support our economy as essential workers. And they deliver our food, keep our lights on, think about the pandemic, right? And they treat people in hospitals, obviously, in many different fields. So racial inequality is a very long-standing and fundamental feature of labor and work in the United States. Workers of color continue to earn lower wages and experience higher unemployment and job turnover. And they're increasingly working in non-standard work arrangements that offer less protection and support than more traditional employment relationships. They reflect the effects of a host of structural disadvantages and discriminatory practices, I believe, such as longstanding racial discrimination in hiring and promotion, mismatches between where people of color live and where good jobs are actually located, the quality of schools in the neighborhood, the decline of unions and weakened worker protections, and the consequence of mass incarceration in communities of color and wealth disparities that arise from a long-time legacy of racism. And additional education does usually not close these wage gaps. Discrimination, particularly in hiring, continues even in the wake of the Civil Rights Act of '64. It also serves as a primary cause of ongoing racial inequality in the labor market. Discrimination is in hiring as very well documented. They've done studies on looking at resumes, experience that they use otherwise matching resumes for real job applications, where the only difference is an indicator of race or gender. They consistently find evidence of racial discrimination in hiring. They found that one foundational study found that resumes with white sounding names receive 50% more callbacks than black sounding names. And subsequent research has found similar results up until 2017. This discrimination also extends to perceptions of criminality. Additional paired testers research has found that white applicants with a criminal record were more likely to get called back for entry-level jobs than black men without a criminal record. That's significant. So although research documents consistent racial discrimination in hiring, much less is known on whether and where that discrimination is concentrated, such as if it's certain firms or in particular industries or occupations. So they really need to do more research on that area to find out specific where this is coming from and how it's being dispersed. Public transportation is another topic. I'm probably not gonna have enough time to finish all this, but because there's so much information on all of it.
And also,
So,
I have a couple of questions that I want to
Okay.
put in there. So,
Yeah, okay, so I'll do it in a couple more minutes and then you can ask a question. So all people need high quality, reliable, and safe transportation to reach jobs, resources, and services, right? But that kind of transportation is not equally accessible to all, obviously. And in many cities, white, highly educated, and high income residents have greater access to public transportation. And wealth differences by race and ethnicity make it easier for white residents to purchase a car, allowing for increased access to jobs. Public transit that is inaccessible for elderly people and people with disabilities can leave transit-dependent residents stranded and not able to connect to whether it's a doctor's or a job. A lack of transit options, particularly during the off-peak hours, means that people who work irregular schedules often have no safe or affordable way to get to work. And we saw a lot of that during the pandemic when they would cut out bus schedules, and a lot of them were for the workers that were working night turns. And it wasn't safe for them to come during the middle of the night to leave or to get to work. The quality of services and amenities such as parks and playgrounds, access to healthcare, and developed infrastructure all depend on the decision of policy stakeholders, obviously. And the local government initiatives are empowered to increase the economic opportunities and property values of the white homeowners, which ultimately preserve a culture of white homogeneous socioeconomic inequalities and residential segregation along the race and class lines. The zoning, such as the redlining, as much as they've outlawed the redlining, it's still existing and is employed continuously in the United States. And through these practices, the pattern of political geography exacerbates social inequities and ultimately limits the spatial distribution and accessibility of quality public goods and services. And most of all, it creates transit deserts, a concept similar to food deserts occur when there's a demand for public transportation exceeds the supply for that. We've got a couple more minutes before you want me to stop. Do you want?
yeah. So I wanted to ask you, because we've talked a lot in previous episodes about social determinants of health. So can you maybe in a sentence or two just talk about how all of this stuff impacts the big picture of social determinants of health?
So if you don't have access to healthy food, right? If you don't have transportation to get to a health facility or to a job or to even earn the money, if you don't have the access to education or the educational facility that you have access to is poorly staffed, is based on that, the past of No Child Left Behind, but also on the schools that get the most money are the ones that get the highest scores. And so a lot of these schools, then what do they do with the kids that are in school that aren't creating the highest scores, right? They often find ways to eliminate them from their population. So in order to be really a very healthy person in this life, we really need access to all these different variables. We also need public policy that's going to support us. And we also need to have the ability to feel safe in the areas and neighborhoods where we live. The interesting thing about the projects that were built during this New Deal, they originally were built for white people because during the Depression, there were so many white people that lost their homes. And then eventually they started allowing, because the people that were in the housing for Black people, they didn't have enough room there. So they started letting Black people come into the white housing projects. And gradually they took over and they stopped providing them with services. They stopped providing them with all the different things I've mentioned, right? Access to health, to education, to health care, to transportation, to grocery stores and so forth.
Right. So we're going to get ready to take a break, but I just wanted to make just a comment. Everything that you just said, like, for example, when you look at what happened in Buffalo, that town was a food desert. And those people worked hard to be able to get a supermarket in their store. And then when you think about what happened with the mass shooting and everything, it kind of makes me think about Rosewood, or it makes me think about Tulsa, Oklahoma, when we make some progress and then somehow we get pushed back again and again and again. Some of the things you talked about also include gentrification, predatory lending. All of those types of things are what kind of put us in the place where we are now. And so many people are still buying into that idea that there's something inherently wrong with us. It's the system that we live in.
When you read this information and you really take in the data, I mean, it's of course, people of color have not been able to access and to achieve any one of their equal partners that might have white skin have been able to.
Right.
Just in passing down.
We're gonna take a quick break and then we'll finish out that thought as soon as we get back, and then we'll jump over to Mavis's topic.
Thanks, Gail. That was great. So Gail, thank you so much for describing those various points that tie us to the 9 social determinants of health that we've talked about over the past few weeks. I was just thinking about how to start this, and how so often one of the first pushbacks I get when I'm talking about racism is slavery was so long ago. Well, when we talk about redlining now, redlining began, if I'm not mistaken, after Reconstruction, when Black people started to migrate to the north, the Great Migration. So there were a lot of peoples coming into the cities looking for these manufacturing jobs. And this was, you know, in the language of the time, disturbing peaceful neighborhoods. And these people were not able to get these loans. They were even discriminated against in terms of being shown homes, being able to even apply for a loan. My former husband was a realtor, and a couple of things I remembered learning from him, and that was the word steering a client to a particular neighborhood, that was illegal. But I didn't know how deep this subject of redlining was, that when you start steering people to a neighborhood, you're basically reinforcing that secret structure behind the community, right? So back in about 1947, there came a Black lady hero. Her name is Mrs. Layla Francis. She was the first Black real estate professional in Ohio, Dayton, as it turns out, and she was only the second realtor in the US. So this was perfect for the Black community. They finally had someone who could relate to them directly and fight for them in terms of the whole process of finding a home. She was really an advocate too. She would go, if she couldn't help them find a loan in the local area, she would go out of state and go to African-American owned banks to construct and creatively put together a financial package so these people could get a home, get into the real estate market. Just parenthetically, I want to tell a quick story about a friend I was chatting with the other day. He's done real well in his life, he and his wife. And he said, boy, when we got married, we didn't have anything. We had a couple of cars and we were $20,000 in credit card debt. And he said, the thing that saved me was the GI Bill. And the GI Bill allowed me to get a loan for a house. So that is the perfect point where Black people were only given about 20% of the amount of the GI Bill loans, and the rest was given to white people. So my friend was able to scale right up in that real estate market, build wealth, and he's got wealth built for his kids and so on. Whereas if Black people weren't lent to, and the places that they were finally able to get houses weren't supported by community services, they really lost their investment. I also noticed from my former husband that he had a pin or something on his jacket and it said, realtor, and there was a registered symbol by that word. And I thought, why is realtor trademarked? And in reading for this program today, I see that, I think I've got this right, the white realtors in the business did not want Black realtors using the same name, the same descriptor. And so, at the hands of this Mrs. Francis and others, they got together and formed this National Association of Real Estate Brokers, also known as the Realtists, Realists, Realtists. I just think that's so fascinating. There's always a way to solve these things. And look at the ingenuity, look at the determination made in these groups of people. So these new Black realtors were so integral to integrating neighborhoods and helping Black families to find homes. I was touched by the story of the Black realtor who found a home for an African-American family. And for a while, to make them feel safe, he stayed at their home at nights while they were integrating into the neighborhood, the white neighborhood. And that's just so heart-wrenching and so brave of this person. I mean, I don't know how he did this with all the houses he sold, but integration began to happen. And I just think that's, nearly miraculous. Another thing that one of the fellows said in this documentary we consumed was about financial education, that often Black people who migrated up from the South and face these housing problems didn't get to experience the finances behind buying a home or watching their parents. They never saw paperwork. They may run a check down the street to somebody who was renting to them, but they didn't know the process. And so one fellow talks about signing an agreement that he really didn't understand the terms. For example, I think it was a rent to own deal where you pay $100 a month, let's say, toward the purchase of your house. But if you miss a payment, all of those down payments toward your house you lose everything. And I think the word he missed was if you miss a payment or if you continue to pay it, So I just thought that was really powerful. I just have been in an environment in my life where I've just always been around the language and, the buying and selling. The woman that Anita spoke about earlier, the woman with the museum in Omaha, talks about all the history of redlining in Omaha. And Omaha is where I studied my undergrad. And Omaha is a fine, big, sprawling city. And it was really the first city where I became exposed to more than one or two Black people. And it was only on the university campus that I saw them. And I think this narrator at the museum even said that Omaha was just growing west, west, west. And this is where white people were building. And I knew without even talking about it with anybody that the Blacks lived in the downtown area. And we just didn't cross paths. So there was no proximity, no ability to learn anything about each other. And so, these are all, it just goes slavery, the Great Migration, but every system is structured so that white people could still progress and Black people did not get to participate in the American dream. And it's just shocking to learn about that. So do you ladies have any corrections or questions?
Yeah, so again, just kind of thinking about all of this, Mavis, because if you remember earlier today when we were preparing for this, we talked about the fact that it was also investments that were not happening in the Black community.
Exactly.
So can you elaborate a little bit on that part of the conversation that we're having, because it's all tying into,
Yes.
how this community becomes a food desert. How does this happen? How does that happen? But it all can be traced back to the implementation of this New Deal redlining process that we still see and feel the impacts of that today.
Yes. Yes. So sometimes when I think of investing, I think I'll buy a property and, put a business there and have it make money for me. I think what we're talking about in this context is giving out loans to these people. You are investing in that community then. You're accepting some risk for that. If you do not invest in these communities, these houses start to run down. I'm trying to remember exactly where it was, but one of the ways they cut Black people out is saying, we won't loan for anything less than 50,000. Even if they needed 19,000, they wouldn't loan for anything less. So the Blacks in these communities couldn't get money to keep up their properties. Therefore, jobs were not, am I getting this right? They're not generating taxes that support the services in the city, support the education, make it worth bringing a fine grocery store to the area. And then the whole area starts to decay. And, I was confessing to my team that I used to associate Black areas and poor areas with danger. But it's not danger, it's the lack of investment. It's the lack of, even respect. These people need somebody to pick up their garbage. How can we cut them out of all these forms of investment? So I hope I hit enough on that, Anita, for you.
Yeah, that was good. And it's actually a good segue into this last segment that I wanted to talk about. And it's this idea of grappling with the whole entire legacy of redlining. So you had talked a little bit about how the Black realtors were more than just real estate agents. They were actually there. You talked about the one gentleman who actually stayed in the home of the new homeowners just to ensure that they would be safe
and not chased away. Yeah,
right, and not chased away, and all of that. So when you think about, if you think about the country of the United States, and it's got all of these pockets of these different communities across the nation, right? And then you talked about how, with the Great Migration as an example, where people were coming and traveling from South, but in order for them to get from where they were down South to get to Omaha or to get to wherever it was, Chicago or Detroit, New York, wherever it is they were headed, involved travel. And so now as you're going along and you're encountering some towns that you might be welcome in, and then you're encountering other towns that you're not welcome in. So now you have sundown towns, right? And there's like this awareness that we had to have as we were traveling from point A to point B. Where can I go and not be harmed? Where can I sleep? Where can I eat and not be harmed? And so the point that I'm making is that recognition that we needed to be able to support one another in ways that are kind of off the radar screen, like with the realtors and some of the things that they were doing. But then you also think about the people who wrote the Green Book or researched the Green Book, got all of the locations along different routes where it was safe for Black people to travel, where it was safe for them to be there, where it was safe that they could be there after sundown and not be concerned about their health. So then you got the Green Book. So you got the Green Book and you got the list of sundown towns. So in your travels, you had to be equipped. so that you would know where to go and where not to go, right? Then you think about, like you had mentioned, Layla, what was her name?
Mrs. Layla Francis.
Yes, Miss Layla Francis, right? And going down to Alabama in order to secure loans for people who lived in Ohio, right?
I knew she went to Memphis for sure. She may have gone to other places in the South. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, let's just say
Yeah.
Memphis.
Okay, yeah.
For the sake of argument, because it doesn't really matter where.
No, it doesn't.
Is that but where she went was to Black communities where they have their own bank. They have their own system of credit. They have their own way of doing business with one another. So you think about Rosewood, the two that come to my mind, Rosewood and Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Absolutely.
We had this.
All there, right.
We had it, in spite of the fact that over our heads, weighing us down, is this redlining process, the systematic redlining process. But then there were areas that we built up. We had our own businesses. We had our own banks. We had our own insurance companies. We had our own funeral parlors because people didn't even want to take care of our dead when, so we had to have our own. So we had our own. And even when we had our own and we built everything up, they burned us out. They dropped fire bombs on us. So this whole idea of us being so monolithically defined, you can't do this, you don't have the skills, you don't have the knowledge. Even when we do, you kill us, you firebomb us, you blow up our communities.
Right.
So I'm saying all of that to say that we have experienced an entire multiple generation of loss, multiple generation of not being able to climb that thing, that ladder,
accumulate wealth,
to
progress, really.
all of that,
to
be able to experience the American dream. Because even when we do it ourselves, and we're starting to experience it within the context of our own system, they burned us out.
White people had to burn it down.
And if you wonder about these stories, please, there are films about Rosewood and about Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Please watch them. It's so important.
Absolutely.
It's just important. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Those stories go forward.
Stories go all the facets.
Right. So I'm glad you said go watch stuff, because one of the things that I want people to kind of catch on to from this discussion is go to this, go and search UnDesign the Redline. And so I think it was either Mavis or Gail had mentioned the exhibit where they have it set up and you can go and you can really look at the full power, the full thrust of the redlining process. They have maps, they have all kinds of information.
Very cool. Yeah.
But at the end of the exhibit, they're talking about how do we undesign all of that? How do we move forward and remove that legacy? And so hence the name UnDesign the Redline. And they have three major pillars, if you will, that's associated with undesigning the redline. The first one is reframe the story. That's create situations and circumstances and changes, social change, institutional change, and all of that to change the narrative. To change the narrative.
Which
right?
A narrative you might not even know is going on in your head.
Exactly. And then the second one is redesign from the bottom up. Let's just take what's there, push that out the way, and start with something new, and start with something fresh that is collaborative and community driven.
Especially community.
Absolutely. And then the last one is
problems. Excuse me, Anita. They'll solve their own problems better than anyone coming from the outside can solve it.
Right, but it's also that collaborative. So I think we got to get to that place.
Oh, sure.
We're working like what we're doing. This is collaborative work.
Mhm.
So we're
Yeah.
doing this together, right? And plus
Yes.
with the community. And then the final one, which is why I asked you the question about the investment, because it's about reinvesting. But it's not just reinvesting money. It's sharing equity, it's wealth building, it's community assets, it's reinvesting in all of that,
Right.
irrespective of race, economic status, and all of that. Because if you think about it, if the New Deal didn't have the racial component,
Oh my
can you
goodness.
imagine how things could have been very different?
Or the GI bills, or I mean, all
The
the
GI
different
bills
things
and
going on.
just
Yeah.
all of that, all of that.
And
So,
Tulsa hadn't been burned down, and right, and
right,
all
if Rosewood was still there, like all of these what if, what if, what if. So what I'm saying is, let's create those what ifs for
Yes.
the future.
right.
If you can stand, people who are hearing our voices, if you can stand with us and say, I am willing to put my faith in a different future, because that's exactly what we're talking about here.
Yes.
Putting
Yeah.
our faith in a different future,
It's a future based in truth.
a future based in truth. Absolutely, absolutely. And exposing truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely exposing.
Absolutely.
Exposing the truth. So we're pretty much almost out of time. And what I wanted to do in this last segment is, this is our Say Their Names segment. And what I want to do is honor the teachers and the children of the Uvalde community. So I'm going to start by calling out the names of the teachers and some of the children, and then we'll continue to Mavis and then to Gail. So the teachers: Irma Garcia, 48. Eva Morales, 44. Nevaeh Alyssa Bravo, 10. Jacqueline Cesares, 9. McKenna Lee Elrod, 10. Jose Manuel Flores Jr., 10. Eliana Garcia, 10.
Osea Garcia, 10. Mary Jo Garza, 10. Xavier Lopez, 10. Haise Carmelo Luvianos, 10. Tess Mata, 10. Miranda Mathis, 11. Alethea Ramirez, 10.
Annabelle Rodriguez, 10. Mate Rodriguez, 10. Alexandria Lexi Rubio, 10. Layla Salazar, 11. Yahela Nicole Seleguera, 10. Ilahana Cruz Torres, 10. Rogelio Torres, 10.
And I want for my quote to be some lyrics that I picked up from a song by the gospel artist Kirk Franklin. Show me your face. Fill up this space. My world needs you right now. God, we need you right now. God, fix what I see. And God, please fix me. I can't escape being afraid, but fill me with you right now. My world needs you right now. We're desperate for you right now to fill up this space. Power fall down, bring with it a sound that points us to you right now. My world needs you right now. Let us see you right now. So our call to action is for everyone to come together in the name of humanity to put our faith in a different future. So I want to thank you for joining us in another insightful conversation from Inflection Point podcast. And you can catch us here on Transformation Talk Radio every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific time and 6 p.m. Eastern time. And signing off for Mavis, Gail, and I, we will see you in the next episode. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.